I knew the world was coming to an end, but I never thought it would be so mundane. It started as any other small-town morning. The sun rose lazily over Centerville, the sleepy little town where I had lived my entire life. There were no signs of what was about to happen, no ominous storm clouds, no foreboding omens. Just the usual quiet, broken only by the hum of the distant highway and the chirp of birds in the trees. People went about their daily routines, store owners opening their shops, the mayor greeting a few passers-by, and kids heading to school, their laughter carrying on the wind. I was standing outside the coffee shop when I saw it, the first one. A man, dragging his feet down the street, eyes glazed over, wearing a tattered suit. He didn't look quite right, his movements jerky and disjointed. I assumed he was drunk. It wasn't that unusual in Centerville. But then I noticed something strange. His face was pale, almost gray, and his hands were stiff at his sides, like he was frozen in time. Before I could question it further, the man stumbled into the street, right in front of the police car that was driving past. The officer slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The man's body crumpled under the tires. I expected the officer to rush out and check for a pulse or call for help. Instead, he just sat there, staring blankly at the scene. "Isn't anyone going to do something?" I muttered to myself, my breath quickening. The officer, still motionless, slowly turned his gaze toward me. "Just another one," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They'll all come. They always do." It took me a few seconds to realize what he meant. The man in the street wasn't just some random accident victim. He was one of the dead. His skin was ashen, his body unnaturally stiff. My heart skipped a beat. I turned away, scrambling back into the coffee shop, my thoughts racing. I needed answers, but there was no one to ask. "Did you see that?" I asked Maria, the woman behind the counter. Her face was pale, but she didn't seem alarmed. She just nodded, wiping down the counter as though it were just another regular day. "Same thing happened yesterday. And the day before that," she said, her voice dull, as if the events unfolding didn't faze her. "It's been happening all over town." I looked out the window, watching as more people, more dead people, began to appear, shuffling through the streets in various states of decay. Some had their clothes torn, some had blood staining their bodies, others looked almost freshly dead. But they all had one thing in common. They were walking, moving, and they didn't seem to care about anything else. The dead didn't run, they didn't scream or thrash about. They simply walked, their eyes vacant, their movements slow but relentless. There was no urgency in their approach, no sense of terror. It was as if they were simply going through the motions, like they had somewhere to be, but didn't know why. I watched in stunned silence as the sheriff, a grizzled older man named Cliff, stepped out onto the porch, adjusting his hat as he took a long, hard look at the growing number of the undead. His hand was steady as he reached for his gun, but his eyes held an expression I couldn't quite place. Weariness, maybe. He knew something I didn't. "You're gonna want to get somewhere safe, kid," he said to me, his voice low and tired. "This isn't like the movies. You can't shoot em in the head. You can't outrun em. You can't stop em. They just keep coming, and they never stop." His words sunk in, and I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't some sort of twisted joke. This was real. Maria was already packing up her things. "I'm leaving," she said, her eyes distant. "I've seen enough of this town, I think. Time to go." But there was nowhere to go. No escape. The entire town was surrounded. I could hear the moans now, echoing through the streets. It was like the dead were everywhere, marching in a slow, unending tide, their numbers growing by the hour. I followed Sheriff Cliff as he led me to his truck. We had to move fast, but it didn't matter how fast we drove. No matter where we went, there would always be more of them. The dead weren't just walking the streets anymore. They were in the fields, in the woods, by the river. They were everywhere. I could hear their moans in the distance, growing louder as we drove, like a dark symphony, slow and inevitable. "You still don't get it, do you?" Cliff said, glancing at me from behind the wheel. They don't want anything. They don't need anything. They're just here. And they'll keep coming. What's the point? I asked, my voice breaking. Why are they doing this? What's happening? He didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, his eyes focused ahead. The dead don't need a reason. They just do. It's like a force of nature. You can't fight it. You can't reason with it. You just have to survive. The truck jolted over a bump in the road, and I glanced out the window. More of them were appearing in the fields, stumbling toward us like a silent army, their numbers increasing with every passing second. They didn't seem to care about us. They didn't chase us or try to break in. They just kept walking. Is this how it ends? I whispered, my voice filled with dread. Sheriff Cliff sighed, as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. It's how it always ends. The dead don't die. They just keep walking. And eventually, they'll outnumber the living. The world around us was falling apart. People who once lived ordinary lives, who once worried about small things, petty things, were now nothing more than witnesses to this never-ending march. It was as if the very concept of living had become a fleeting, inconsequential memory. And so we kept driving, the sound of their footsteps echoing in our ears, the sense of doom rising like a tide. The dead didn't need to chase us. They didn't need to run. They had all the time in the world. Because, after all, the dead don't die. And neither do their footsteps. The next few days blurred together. There was no sense of time anymore, no way to mark the passing of the hours. All I could hear was the slow, rhythmic shuffle of the undead outside, their constant presence a reminder that the world, as we knew it, was over. We didn't stay in one place for long. Every house, every shop, every gas station we stopped at became another graveyard. People we knew, friends, neighbors, became part of the horde. Cliff seemed unaffected by it all, like he had seen it all before. He was distant, resigned. It wasn't anger that consumed him, nor fear. It was kind of exhaustion. Why aren't they attacking us? I asked him one night, as we camped by the side of the road. The fire flickered weakly in the distance, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. The dead had passed by earlier, but they hadn't stopped. They never did. They don't need to, Cliff muttered, staring into the fire. The dead don't need a reason. They just walk. You think they're out there looking for us? Nah. They're out there looking for nothing. Just walking. That's their nature. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. It didn't make sense. The stories I had heard, the movies I'd watched, all painted a picture of the dead hungry for flesh, for violence, for something. But this was different. The dead didn't care about us. They didn't need us. They just moved relentlessly, as if caught in some eternal cycle of decay and emptiness. And that realization, it hit me hard. There was no hope, no salvation. The dead weren't part of some grand scheme, some apocalypse that would lead to rebirth. They were simply an echo of something that had once been alive, endlessly repeating emotion with no purpose other than to exist. I looked up at the sky. The stars were fading. The world was fading. But the dead, they just kept walking, and they wouldn't stop. It started like any other year. The calendar flipped from 2023 to 2024 with the usual pomp and circumstance. Fireworks burst across the sky, parties spilled into the streets, and people across the globe counted down to midnight with the kind of optimism that only the dawn of a new year could bring. But for me, something fell off. The excitement felt forced, the joy tainted by an uneasy sense of anticipation that I couldn't shake. For months leading up to this new year, there had been rumors circulating, whispers about the return of Y2K. People said it would happen again, that the century-old bug lurking in old systems would rise from its dormant slumber and wreak havoc. The media called it Y2K 2.0, a viral social media hashtag that resurfaced old fears. But I, like most others, dismissed it as a relic of a bygone era, a problem solved long ago, a ghost of the past. But as the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the usual buzz of a new year. It was the silence that followed. The noise, the music, the cheers suddenly stopped. There were no fireworks in the sky, no New Year's countdown on the giant screens in the middle of Times Square. Just a deep, gnawing silence. I pulled out my phone, hoping to catch the moment, but the screen was frozen. I pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the Wi-Fi, but it wasn't just my phone. All around me, people's phones were glitching or completely dead, their screens frozen or flashing cryptic error messages. A few shouted for help. Some started laughing nervously, trying to brush it off. I didn't feel like laughing. At first, it seemed like a weird glitch, maybe a server overload from millions of people trying to upload their celebrations at once. But it didn't stop. Hours passed. People in the streets turned to face the screens again, trying to get something, anything, but they were met with static. Blank screens. There was no response. The power flickered. And then the first outages began. In the dead of night, the city's lights slowly started to go out. Flickering streetlights cast strange shadows. Cars stalled in the middle of intersections. I walked toward a nearby convenience store, hoping to get some answers. The sign on the door read, "Sorry, we are closed due to technical difficulties." As I pushed the door open, the jingle of the bell above the entrance didn't sound. The lights were dim, and the air felt thick. Behind the counter, the clerk stood motionless, staring blankly at the cash register. The register had a flashing error code, one that looked oddly familiar. It was the same type of error you would have seen back in the early 2000s, right before the millennium. It couldn't be, right? This was all a weird coincidence. I took a deep breath and asked him, "Is everything okay? What's happening?" He turned to me slowly, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if he didn't recognize me. Or maybe he was just in shock. I don't know," he whispered. "It's just all the systems. They're failing." I looked down at the counter and saw the old-fashioned cash register, the kind that had been obsolete for years. The numbers were flickering on its screen. January 1st, 1900. The year read 1900, not 2024. A cold chill ran down my spine. The Y2K bug had never truly been fixed. It had only been postponed, buried under layers of patchwork software, forgotten systems, and half-hearted solutions. The Millennium Bug, the flaw that had once threatened to collapse the global infrastructure, was back. It was dormant for years, but something had triggered it. The clock, the date, the very fabric of the digital world had somehow woken up again. I stumbled out of a store and into the chaos of the city. People were panicking now. Those who hadn't been affected were desperately trying to make calls, checking their phones, demanding answers. But the more I looked around, the more I realized there was no escape. The bug had spread far beyond the city's borders. It had reached the very core of the digital infrastructure, banks, transportation, the internet, the very heartbeat of modern life. Power outages began to sweep across the city. Store after store went dark. Traffic lights blinked out. Hospitals were relying on backup generators. Cars, once dependable and efficient, were left useless, stuck in gridlock as traffic reports, now interrupted, told people that the traffic lights had gone offline. I ran to my apartment, hoping to at least reach some form of communication. The television had no signal. The internet was down. I tried to call my family, but my phone remained dead. In the panic, people weren't thinking clearly. They had no idea what was really happening. They thought it was just another glitch, some software failure. But this was different. The clock had turned, and with it, an entire system had been reset to the beginning. The next day, I woke to an eerie quiet. The city felt empty. People had retreated into their homes, desperate to figure out what was happening. The streets, once crowded with people rushing to work or heading to events, were now devoid of life. I ventured out, walking through the now deserted city. And then I saw it. A giant digital clock in the middle of a plaza, one that had been counting down to the new year, now read January 1st, 1900. The date had reverted to the turn of the century. The Y2K bug wasn't just an issue of dates. It was systemic. It was foundational. It had triggered something far worse than just a glitch. In that moment, I realized that the bug wasn't just messing with the systems. It was rewriting the world's digital framework, pushing everything backward, like the universe itself had been reset, caught in an infinite loop. I tried to contact someone, anyone, but the lines were down. The satellites, the grid, everything was failing, collapsing in on itself. The weight of a millennium-old flaw slowly suffocating our world. We were slipping back into a time we had long left behind. Days passed, then weeks. The government issued brief statements, but nothing could stop the chaos. The tech industry scrambled to fix the issue, but the damage was done. Banks froze, and the global stock market crashed, spiraling into a panic. People couldn't buy food. They couldn't travel. Governments were paralyzed, their infrastructure brought to a halt. The horror wasn't just in the collapse. It was in the realization that this bug had always been with us, quietly lying in wait for the right moment to strike. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. And now, it was when. By the time we understood the depth of all, it was too late. We weren't just reverting to an earlier date. We were being dragged backward into a world that couldn't sustain us, one that had long outgrown the technology that once defined it. There was no escape. There was no fix. The world had turned back. We were living in 1900 again. Only, this time, there was no way out. The systems, the networks, the advances of civilization, everything that defined the modern age, had been erased. It wasn't just Y2K. It was the Y2K reversal. And we were all stuck in the past.
I used to think smiles were a sign of warmth, a gesture of kindness, reassurance, or joy. But that was before. Before I saw the truth behind them. Before they became the source of my nightmares. It started with Amanda. She was a nurse at the hospital where I worked. Quiet, dependable, the kind of person who stayed calm in a crisis. But that day, she wasn't herself. Her eyes were hollow, her movements jerky, like a puppet being poorly controlled. And then there was her smile. It stretched too wide across her face, pulling at the corners of her mouth unnaturally, like her skin was being forced into place by an unseen hand. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was something else, something sinister. "Amanda, are you okay?" I asked her, trying to sound calm. She didn't answer. She just stood there, grinning at me. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and I noticed that everyone else in the room had stopped what they were doing. They were staring at Amanda too, their faces reflecting the same uneasy confusion I felt. Then, in one swift motion, she pulled out a scalpel from her pocket and slashed her own throat. The blood sprayed in a wide arc, painting the walls and floor, and she collapsed to the ground, her grin never fading, even in death. The scream that escaped me didn't feel like my own. Chaos erupted around me, people yelling, running, calling for help. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at Amanda's lifeless body, and at that grin that seemed to mock me. The police ruled it a suicide, though none of us could understand why Amanda would do something like that. She had no history of mental illness, no signs of distress. But then, strange things started happening. It wasn't just me. Other people who had been in the room that day started acting differently. At first, it was subtle. A colleague would laugh a little too long at a joke that wasn't funny, or smile to themselves when they thought no one was looking. But soon, the smiles grew wider, stranger, more forced. And then, the deaths began. One by one, they started killing themselves, each in a more horrifying way than the last. And every time, they had that same grin on their face, like they were in on some terrible secret that the rest of us couldn't understand. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. That there was a logical explanation for all of it. But deep down, I knew better. There was something else at work, something malevolent. Something that had started with Amanda and was now spreading like a virus. I started seeing the smiles everywhere. On the street, in the grocery store, even in the mirror. They would appear suddenly, lingering just long enough to send a chill down my spine before disappearing again. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. I wasn't the only one. My friend and coworker, Sarah, confided in me that she'd been seeing them too. "It's like it's following us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Like it's waiting for the right moment." What is? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The smile, she said. It's not just a smile. It's something else. Something alive. That night, Sarah killed herself. I found her in her apartment, hanging from the ceiling fan, her face twisted into that same grotesque grin. On the wall, scrawled in her own blood, were the words, "It's coming for you." I tried to run. I packed a bag and left town, driving aimlessly for hours, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cursed hospital as possible. But no matter where I went, the smiles followed. I saw them in the faces of strangers, in the shadows on the walls, even in the headlights of oncoming cars. It wasn't just in my mind. I knew that now. It was real. And it wanted me. Desperate, I turned to the internet, searching for any clue, any explanation. That's when I found it, a thread on an obscure forum, filled with stories eerily similar to mine. People from all over the world, describing the same phenomenon, a chain of suicides, each victim smiling, each death preceded by sightings of the same haunting grin. One user claimed to know the truth. They called it the entity, a malevolent force that fed on fear and despair, spreading from person to person like a curse. It didn't just kill its victims, it consumed them, taking their pain and twisting it into something it could use to grow stronger. The only way to escape, they said, was to pass it on. To make someone else the next target. But even as I read those words, I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't condemn someone else to this nightmare. The days blurred together after that. I stopped going to work, stopped answering my phone. I barely ate, barely slept. The entity was always there, watching, waiting. I could feel it in the corners of my vision, hear it in the whispers that filled the silence of my empty apartment. And then, one night, it came for me. I woke to find myself standing in front of the mirror, a scalpel in my hand, my reflection grinning back at me. It wasn't my smile. It was its smile. My hands trembled as I fought to drop the scalpel, to look away, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, a puppet on invisible strings. It whispered to me, its voice like nails scraping against glass. "You can end it," it said. "You can be free. All it takes is one cut." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. But the voice was inside my head now, burrowing deeper, its words wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. I don't know how long I stood there, battling the entity's control. Minutes? Hours? But eventually, I felt something shift. A small spark of defiance flared within me, a reminder that I was still me. That I still had a choice. I opened my eyes and stared into the mirror. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse but steady. "You don't control me." The entity's grin faltered for the briefest of moments, and I seized the opportunity. I threw the scalpel to the floor and smashed the mirror with my fist, shattering its image into 1,000 pieces. But even as the shards fell, I knew it wasn't over. The entity wasn't gone, it had merely retreated, waiting for its next move. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you've seen the smile, if you've felt its presence, you need to act. It's not just a curse, it's a predator. And it won't stop until it has consumed everything you are. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. But if you're reading this, remember, the smile isn't a sign of joy. It's a warning. And it's watching you too.